During the war, there was an almost iron rule. It was impossible to physically reach Stalin. His security was constructed in such a way as to exclude even the very thought of an assassination attempt. Routes were concealed, access was filtered, and Moscow lived under the dense control of the special services. It seemed that an insurmountable wall lay between the enemy and the Kremlin. But in the autumn of '44, this certainty develops a crack. The German special services send into the Soviet rear a man who is supposed to go where, by all the laws of war, it should have been impossible to go. He has someone else's name, someone else's biography, documents of a SMERSH officer, and a weapon intended for a single shot that could have changed the course of history. The most frightening thing begins not when this man is caught, but when it becomes clear. His arrest ends nothing. On the contrary, it is precisely at this moment that the true scale of the operation opens up. Because behind the failed assassination attempt, another game is hidden. Secret, multi-move, and so highly classified that for decades it was known only from fragments of archival traces. Until the autumn of '44, the very thought of an assassination attempt on Stalin inside the Soviet Union seemed almost absurd. This was not merely an opinion of propaganda and not a soothing formula for newspapers. This is how the people thought who knew better than anyone the price of a mistake. Security, counterintelligence, the army leadership, and the apparatus of state security. Stalin lived inside a multi-layered protection system where one barrier duplicated another. Routes changed, schedules were concealed, and the circle of those initiated was extremely narrow. Even in his own state, the path to him lay through a dense network of checks, clearances, passwords, and unobtrusive surveillance that was rarely recorded on paper. In wartime, Moscow, this system became even harsher. The capital was not just an administrative center, but the nerve hub of a country waging a war of annihilation. Here, any suspicious movement could attract the attention of a patrol, the commandant's office, NKVD organs, or military counterintelligence. To make a mistake meant to disappear into inspections already at the first stage. The German special services understood this no worse than the Soviet side. They could drop saboteurs, blow up bridges, work on railways, gather intelligence data, and try to infiltrate agents into the rear. But an assassination attempt on Stalin required an entirely different level of audacity. It was necessary not simply to cross the front line, but to enter the heart of a closed system and remain unnoticed within it. That is precisely why many professionals considered such a design more a political fantasy than a real operational plan. Too many obstacles stood before the executor. Every document, every award, every detail of the uniform, every pause in conversation had to be explained. One wrong look at a checkpoint could be enough for failure. But by that moment, the war was changing. The Red Army was advancing, the front was rolling westward, and for Germany, time was compressing. The worse the situation became at the fronts, the stronger the temptation to deliver not a military, but a psychological blow. If it was impossible to stop the Soviet offensive by ordinary means, there remained the dream of a pinpoint strike at the summit of the whole system, at Stalin himself. Thus arises a design that even today sounds almost unbelievable. Into the Soviet rear they decide to send not just a saboteur, but a man with a carefully assembled legend of an officer. He must look like one of their own. He must speak like one of their own. He must present documents, awards, and the behavior of a frontline veteran without arousing immediate suspicion in those who are used to catching a lie at first glance. In the autumn of '44, this impossible scheme receives concrete embodiment. The future executor has a name, a legend, a route, and a special weapon for a concealed killing. This is no longer abstract talk of sabotage, and not another rumor story of the wartime rear. For the first time, the threat acquires the outlines of a real case, where between design and execution there remains a dangerously short distance. And at this moment, the main rule of the whole story collapses. It turns out that the question is no longer whether such a plan is possible in principle. The question is different: how far it has already managed to go, and who exactly already knows about it on both sides of the front. And because where everyone was sure of complete impossibility, a man suddenly appears who was supposed to come closer to Stalin than anyone. His name was Pyotr Ivanovich Tavrin, but even that name was not the one with which he had been born. His real surname was Shilo. When in the autumn of 44 he steps into his main role, he is about 35 years old. An age quite convincing for a frontline officer, dangerously mature for a saboteur, and almost ideal for an adventurer. In the history of the attempt on Stalin, it is important to understand one thing immediately. Before us is not a fanatic with a straightforward biography and not an impeccably trained career intelligence officer of the classical type. Tavrin is a figure far more disturbing. His path consists of escapes, substitutions, dark turns, and a constant striving to survive at any cost, even if for that one has to change one's face. According to open data, even before the war, a criminal trace stretches behind him. Episodes appear in his biography that fit poorly with the image of a future Soviet officer, but it is precisely such people who sometimes prove especially useful to special services. A man with cracks in his past more easily takes risks, more easily accepts a new legend, and more quickly renounces his old life. Then the war begins, and the chaos of the first years gives such biographies a chance to dissolve into the enormous mass of human movements. Frontline, evacuation, change of units, loss of documents, death of witnesses. All this creates an environment where the past can be rewritten anew. For some, this becomes a chance for redemption. For others, an opportunity finally to turn life into a chain of roles. At what moment Pyotr Shilo becomes Pyotr Tavrin is a question not only formal. This is already not simply a change of surname, but a transformation into a man capable of existing under someone else's shell. In the case materials and later publications, he appears as a flexible, cold-blooded, and very observant man. He knows how to adapt. He knows how to listen. He knows how to guess what is expected of him. For the German side, exactly such a type was needed. Not a poster hero, not a brilliant officer with impeccable bearing, but a man capable of portraying anyone. His strength lies not in charisma, but in adaptability. He can play a wounded frontline veteran, a tired major, a man with merit and the right to speak sharply. In his case, the legend is built not over the personality, but grows together with it. By the moment when the German special services take an interest in him, Tavrin turns out to be rare material. He knows Soviet reality from the inside, understands the language of the front, the manner of officers' communication, the price of awards, and the weight of intonation. He is capable of withstanding interrogative pressure and at the same time not breaking at once. For an operation where one wrong detail means death, this quality is more important even than physical courage. The Germans needed a man who would not provoke immediate rejection by the Soviet system. Not simply an agent who had penetrated into the rear, but a figure capable of entering it as if by right. Therefore, they create for Tavrin the image of a SMERSH major, supply him with documents, awards, and elements of a frontline veteran's biography. He must look like a man whom they do not detain, but let through. There is an almost frightening precision in this design. The war taught millions of people to recognize uniforms, insignia, combat orders, and the manner of carrying oneself in formation. To make a mistake in such things was mortally dangerous, which means the executor must not simply carry someone else's documents. He is obliged to live inside his role. In essence, Tavrin is prepared not as a saboteur in the ordinary sense, but as a carefully assembled legend. His task is formulated with utmost clarity and therefore sounds horrifying. To penetrate deep into the country, get to Moscow, establish himself under the guise of a Soviet officer, and wait for the moment when it would be possible to strike at the highest leadership. The main target is Stalin, not symbolically, not propagandistically, but physically. That is what makes the Tavrin case one of the most audacious episodes of the entire War of Special Services. For this mission, he is issued a special weapon, a device known as the Panzerknacker. Its very appearance in the case changes the tone of the narrative. This is no longer a story about a pistol in a pocket, and not a fantasy about a random shot. We are talking about a specially prepared means of concealed attack. Рассчитанное? No, translating, designed for suddenness, close distance, and one decisive moment, after which there would be no way back. But at the center of this story still stands not the weapon, but the bearer of the design himself. Tavrin is important because he suits this role psychologically. He does not give the impression of a man driven by an idea. Rather the opposite. He is driven by calculation, the instinct of survival, the habit of changing shells and going where the risk is maximal. And it is precisely such people who sometimes turn out to be more dangerous than convinced fanatics. When one looks at his biography as a whole, an unpleasant feeling arises of emptiness at the center of his personality. He seems all the time to consist of temporary versions of himself. Criminal, fugitive, soldier, man with a new surname, then agent. Each new layer does not cancel the previous one, but hides it. That is why Tavrin becomes a convenient instrument. He knows how to exist without a firm inner core. It is precisely here that the real anxiety of this story begins. The Germans choose not simply an executor, but a man created for dangerous imitation. One who can enter the Soviet system not as a stranger, but as one of its own. And if in the first act the assassination itself seemed impossible, now something else begins to seem impossible. That such a man could exist at all, be assembled, prepared, and sent on his way. By the autumn of '44, the design takes shape as a concrete operation. Behind Tavrin stands the German intelligence sabotage structure, Zeppelin. This is no longer improvisation by desperate people and not a one-time adventure. Before us is a carefully assembled scheme where every detail is subordinated to one goal, to bring the agent to Moscow. In this scheme, not only the executor himself is important, but the whole mechanism that moves him forward. Curators are needed who know how to prepare a legend. Specialists are needed in documents, awards, and uniforms. People are needed who can choose a route, a drop zone, and a means of withdrawal after landing. An operation of such a level cannot rest on one man alone, even if it is he who will later receive all the fame and all the blame. Tavrin does not act alone. Along with him they send Lydia Shilova. In the case materials, she appears as a radio operator and companion, a figure outwardly secondary, but in fact critically important. Without stable communication with the center, the whole operation turns into blind movement into the unknown. The German side needs not simply an agent in the rear, but an agent who can report, receive instructions, and confirm that the game continues. That is precisely why the preparation is built on several levels at once. The first is external. Tavrin must look like a Soviet officer who has gone through the front. The second is behavioral. He's obliged to speak, move, answer questions, and even remain silent in such a way as not to arouse suspicion. The third is technical. Weapon, communications, documents, transport, route, and legend must work as a single mechanism. They create for him the image of a SMERSH major. This decision is almost audacious to the point of madness. To forge the documents of an ordinary serviceman is already dangerous. To forge the documents of an employee of military counterintelligence means to enter a zone where any mistake will be noticed, especially quickly. But in the logic of the operation, this looks like calculation, not madness. A SMERSH officer has the right to severity, secrecy, limited frankness, which means his oddities can be explained by service specificity. The legend is strengthened by awards. In wartime, orders and medals are not merely metal on a gymnastiorka. They are a language of trust, a sign of belonging to frontline experience, proof of blood and service. But that is precisely why any inconsistency becomes fatal. One must know how and for what awards were given, in what order they are worn, how people speak about them and how they do not speak about them. A mistake here is more dangerous than a mistake in a surname. Preparation also concerns the weapon. Tavrin is issued the special device Panzerknacker, intended for concealed use. The very fact of the presence of such a means shows that the design of the assassination was considered not as symbolic sabotage, but as a practical task. They are not counting on luck here. They are looking for a way to bring the executor close enough to the target that one short moment will decide the outcome of the whole operation. A plane is prepared to deliver the group into the rear. This is one of the riskiest stages of the entire plan. It is necessary to cross the front line, avoid detection, choose a landing area, and not lose the people before the mission even begins. Every kilometer of the flight passes over territory where the price of a mistake is measured not by mission failure, but by instant death. But without this flight, the whole operation remains only a drawing on a table. After landing, the group is supposed to use a motorcycle. This is a detail that says a lot about the German side's calculation. They understand that in the first hours after insertion, speed decides everything. The agent must not linger near the landing place, must not move slowly, must not depend on random rides. He needs to tear himself away from the dangerous zone as quickly as possible, before the area has been taken under dense observation and before tracks lead searchers directly to the target. Then begins the main section of the route. Movement deep into the country. And here Tavrin's task looks almost absurd in its complexity. He must not simply survive after insertion, but dissolve into the living tissue of the Soviet rear. Pass posts, withstand inspections, not break under random questions, not betray himself in trifles. In such an operation, not only documents decide, but intonation, posture, gait, the way of asking for water or presenting identification. The German side is betting on the fact that war overloads any system. Masses of people pass through roads, stations, and communication hubs. Units are moving, hospitals work without stopping, headquarters hurry, documents are lost, faces change. In this movement, an agent can try to hide in plain sight, but it is a desperate bet. The closer to Moscow, the denser the control, the more attentive the patrols, and the more terrible the consequences of any inspection that lasts 1 minute too long. For the Soviet side, the risk is also enormous, although for now it still does not see the whole picture. If such an agent slips away after landing, he will disappear into the space of the rear, where finding one man is almost impossible. If he really reaches the capital, then even an unsuccessful assassination attempt will become an event not only operational, but political. The very fact that the enemy managed to come so close will strike at the image of the impenetrability of the whole system. That is precisely why in this story, the atmosphere of 44 is so important. The Red Army is advancing, Germany is retreating, but the war is still far from over. At such moments, operations calculated not for a frontline result, but for shock are especially dangerous. To kill or even try to kill Stalin means to strike at the nerve center of the state, force the system to divert forces, generate alarm, rumors, and internal tension at the moment of a general offensive. From the German point of view, the stake looks almost like the last major game. If the front is breaking, one must look for a way to reverse the situation outside the battlefield. That is what an operation is needed, for that seems impossible. The more unbelievable the design, the stronger its possible effect. Therefore, Tavrin is prepared not as an ordinary saboteur, but as the instrument of a single, exceptional strike that cannot have a second attempt. But it is precisely here that another dimension of this story enters the matter: the hidden work of Soviet counterintelligence. We still do not see it at full height, but we feel its presence. SMERSH, the NKVD, local organs of observation and interception, already exist as a system that knows how to react to alarming signals faster than the enemy imagines. And while Tavrin is being prepared for penetration, The other side is perhaps already learning to read his steps before he makes them. The night of the insertion becomes the point where a carefully assembled plan first collides with living war. The aircraft crosses the front line and enters a space where the beautiful calculations of staffs no longer apply. Here, every sound of the engine can be heard, every flash in the sky noticed, every extra circle above the ground turned into an alarm signal for those who know how to wait precisely for such guests. According to available data, the flight does not go as the German center expected. The plane is detected, fire is opened on it, and the landing turns from a covert operation into a risky breakthrough through mounting danger. In such a minute, the most important illusion of any sabotage collapses, that the main thing begins after landing. In fact, the main thing begins already in the air, when the enemy understands that you are near. And yet the operation does not break off in the sky. The machine lands, the group finds itself on the ground, which means Tavrin still has a chance to fulfill at least the first part of the task, to get out of the landing area and dissolve into the depth of the rear. It is precisely here that the tension becomes almost physical, because the first few hours decide more than months of preparation. If he slips away now, catching him later will be many times more difficult. In these minutes, everything works against him, and at the same time for him, against him. Alarm, fire, the risk of encirclement, the attention of local forces. For him, darkness, speed, a pre-thought-out withdrawal, and that very quality for which he was chosen, the ability instantly to change behavior according to circumstances. After landing, Tavrin no longer plays a role at a slow tempo. Now he lives in it at the limit, as only people live who understand the price of every second. Beside him is Lydia Shailova. Her presence at this moment is especially important because the group is not simply fleeing danger. It must preserve the integrity of the operation. The loss of the radio operator would mean almost total loss of communication with the center. And without communication, any further plan begins to crumble. The war of special services is cruel precisely in such details. Sometimes the fate of an enormous design depends not on a shot, but on whether it is possible to carry out the suitcase with the radio set. After landing, the motorcycle prepared for rapid exit from the dangerous zone comes into play. This is not an impressive detail, but a vital necessity. On foot, they are almost doomed. Traces remain at the landing place, noise, the logic of pursuit by which they will be searched for. They must get away before the area is finally tightened by patrols and search groups. Speed becomes their only chance to turn an accident into continuation of the operation. But precisely here is hidden one of the main dramas of this story. The faster Tavrin moves away from the landing site, the more he must rely on the legend. One can no longer simply hide in the forest. One must come out to roads, to people, to inspections. One must become visible while preserving invisibility. This is the most dangerous kind of camouflage. When a man hides in a uniform and an identification card, he is forced to look in the eyes of those who have the right to ask one extra question. The area, meanwhile, comes into motion. Alarm arises, local observation forces are raised, inspections are intensified. What from the German side might have seemed an abnormal but still tolerable landing, for the Soviet side looks like a serious signal. And although in the first hours, no one is yet obliged to know the whole design of the operation, the very logic of the wartime rear demands a reaction. Any suspicious landing behind the front line is regarded as a potential threat of large scale. Here appears that very double layer of crisis, without which the Tavrin case cannot be understood to the end. Outwardly, the German operation is already cracking at the seams. The plane is detected, the landing disrupted, the group forced to improvise. But internally, at the level of meaning, the danger is only increasing. The Soviet side still does not know who exactly stands before it. They may be ordinary saboteurs, they may be couriers, they may be razvedchiki, scouts, or they may be people heading to the very center of power. It is precisely the lack of clarity that makes the situation truly dangerous. If, from the first minutes, it had been clear that the matter concerned an assassination attempt on Stalin, the case would instantly have received the highest priority. But history works otherwise. First, there are always visible the fragments of the external event. Landing, traces, detentions, documents, weapons. And the true scale begins to emerge only later, as each new detail ceases to fit into the version of an ordinary sabotage group. Tavrin and Shailova try to hold on to the legend because they no longer have any other path. Everything that was prepared in advance must now withstand collision with Soviet reality. Documents, uniform, awards, manner of speaking, all this ceases to be props and becomes the last line of defense. In such moments, a person betrays himself not only by words, he can be ruined by the tempo of his answer, an incorrect reaction to a shout, an instinctive movement of the hand, a glance directed the wrong way. And precisely here, it becomes especially clear why in this story it was so easy for both sides to make a mistake. The Germans could overestimate the strength of their legend. The Soviet organs could underestimate the scale of the threat. The most dangerous trap in such operations is to decide that the matter is already finished at the moment when in fact it is only beginning to unfold. One arrest guarantees nothing. Two detained people do not yet mean that the network ends with them. If behind this group there stands a broader design, then a straightforward reaction can turn out to be a defeat. One can seize the executors and still not understand what task they carried, who prepared them, and whether the German center is waiting for a signal for the next move. Therefore, the crisis in the Tavrin case is not only a scene of interception. It is the moment when for the Soviet side there arises the risk of taking a visible victory for the final result and thereby losing the main thing. In essence, it is precisely after the first hours of the German operation's failure that the tension reaches its highest point. Because now the stake changes. The matter is no longer only whether the agent will get away. The matter is whether Soviet counterintelligence officers will manage to understand whom exactly they have seized before the last traces of the design disappear. In the war of special services, sometimes the most dangerous thing is not to miss the enemy, but to decide too quickly that you have already understood him. Thus, the abnormal landing turns into a prologue to the real investigation. The visible crisis ends comparatively quickly, but behind it, another deeper one opens. It is necessary to determine whether this was a lone dash by desperate intelligence or part of a carefully calculated operation of the highest level. It is necessary to understand why a man with documents of a SMERSH major was dropped into the rear and why beside him there is a radio operator capable of maintaining communication with the center. At this moment, the story still could have gone down the simple path. Arrest, interrogation, closure of the case, a short report upward. That is exactly how many operations end, operations that later sink into archives. But the Tavrin case emerges from this logic, because too much in it points to something greater. And the more attentively the Soviet side peers into the captured people, the more frightening the conclusion becomes. Perhaps the enemy has come much closer to the unthinkable goal than anyone wanted to admit. It is precisely at this moment that the Soviet side makes the decision that makes the Tavrin case exceptional. To seize the saboteurs was important, but this is no longer enough. If before counterintelligence there are indeed not simply a pair of dropped agents, but a channel to an operation of special importance, then the most valuable thing is hidden not in their belongings and not in their first statements, but in the connection that can still be used. Thus arises the idea of a radio game, later known under the name fog. Its meaning is simple only at first glance. One must not simply force the enemy to believe that the group survived. One must hold this belief day after day, answer after answer, without letting the enemy sense falsity either in the intonation of the messages, or in the rhythm of communication, or in the trifles that an experienced center catches faster than a novice notices. Now Tavrin and Shailova are transformed from captured agents into a dangerous instrument. They can no longer be regarded only as evidence. They become part of a new operation where every mistake will have a double price. If the Germans believe, the Soviet side will receive time, initiative, and access to the enemy channel. If the Germans suspect substitution, the game will break off, and with it will disappear the chance to understand the depth of the original design. In this new phase, Lydia Shilova becomes especially important. It is she who is connected with the radio channel. It is through her that one can maintain the illusion that the group is not only alive, but acting in accordance with the plan. The war of special services often looks like a duel of strong figures, but sometimes everything rests on the voice of a person at the transmitter, on the precision of a formulation, on a vydzhenaya pause between reception and reply, a measured pause. The beginning of such a game requires not only technical preparation, but also a special psychological discipline. The German center expects not theater, but working communication. It will ask clarifying questions, demand confirmations, check details, and seek familiar signs of authenticity. Here it is impossible to play in broad strokes. One must think as the enemy would think, and at the same time as the agent should answer, having found himself in an alien and dangerous rear. The very logic of the game is built on plausibility. Messages cannot be too smooth or prepared. Lies will be suspected in them. But they also cannot be too confused, or the center will decide that the group has lost manageability. It is necessary to create the impression of a living, vulnerable, but still workable operation. Not triumph and not catastrophe, but precisely dangerous movement forward through difficulties that the German center will regard as natural. This is the main turning point of the whole story. Before this moment, the Germans are trying to reach Stalin by using Tavrin as a weapon. After the beginning of the radio game, the Soviet side takes the same weapon and directs it back. Now the task is no longer merely to find out whether the enemy wanted to kill the Soviet leader. Now the task is broader, to make German intelligence live inside a false reality built for it and make decisions on the basis of this lie. For SMERSH and the structures connected with it, this means a sharp change of tempo. Arrest is a direct and rapid action. A radio game is an operation of endurance. Here one must win not seconds, but weeks and months. One must pull the thread without breaking it, and at the same time not allow the enemy to turn this connection into a means of pressure on the Soviet side already. In other words, hunter and prey change places, but the danger for the hunter does not disappear anywhere. The German center continues the correspondence. From this follows the main conclusion. At least at the first stage, the enemy does not understand that the channel is already under someone else's control. It requests information, clarifies the group's position, asks about prospects, and demands further development of the legend. For the Soviet side, each such reply becomes proof that the design is working. The longer the enemy believes, the more valuable the game itself becomes. But here another hidden risk arises. The Germans need only feel the slightest inconsistency, and they may not only break off communication, but also change their subsequent actions. Therefore, every message must be verified almost like an operational document of the highest level. One must think not only about content, but about consequences. What will arouse trust? What will seem natural? What will push the enemy toward new steps without forcing it to become cautious? From this minute, the Tavrin case ceases to be simply a story about a foiled assassination attempt. It turns into a complex counterintelligence combination. The Soviet side is no longer satisfied with the fact of preventing the strike. It needs to use the enemy's very failure for a larger goal. To understand how far the Zeppelin channel extends, how the German center thinks, and whether it is preparing new insertions according to the same logic. Thus arises a rare wartime sensation of an inverted hunt. Just recently, Tavrin was supposed to go deep into the Soviet system, hiding his false essence under the uniform of a SMERSH major. Now his own mission becomes bait. His presence, his legend, his failed route. All this is used no longer against Moscow, but against those who in Berlin or at a frontline center still believe that they hold the threads in their hands. This decision requires sanction at the very top. Too high is the stake, too unusual the object of the game. The matter concerns not an ordinary agent and not a secondary section of the front, but a case connected with a potential assassination attempt on the supreme leader of the country. Therefore, the continuation of the operation under Soviet control inevitably goes beyond the framework of an ordinary local episode and becomes a task of special importance for the whole security system. The longer the game lasts, the more clearly the real meaning of what happened emerges. The assassination itself, however audacious it may have been, turns out to be only the first layer of the story. Under it, another opens, about how counterintelligence knows how to transform a threat into a resource. In this lies the true cruelty of secret war. Here, it is not enough to repel a strike. One must make it so that the enemy's very swing becomes the source of its future defeat, and yet it is still too early at this moment to speak of complete victory. A radio game is always movement on thin ice. The slightest inconsistency, too convenient a version, a sudden change of the habitual rhythm, a mistake in details, and the enemy will begin to retreat into the shadows, carrying away with it the answers to the most important questions. Therefore, the tension does not go away, it simply changes form. Now the danger no longer races on a motorcycle down a night road, but lives in every transmitted signal. For the history of the assassination itself, this means a decisive transformation. At the beginning of the third act, before us was a German operation to deliver an agent into the Soviet rear. By its end, we see a completely different picture. Tavrin no longer moves towards Stalin as the executor of the strike. He is turned into an element of a game conducted by SMERSH. And the more successful this game, the farther the German side moves into the false idea that its design is still alive. That is precisely why the Tavrin case preserved for decades an almost legendary coloring. In it, two plots were joined at once: an attempt at an impossible assassination and the hidden operation that followed it, where the arrest did not put a period, but opened a new phase of struggle. For ordinary military history, this is too winding a turn. For the history of special services, it is almost ideal. Here, victory is achieved not at the moment of detention, but at the moment when the enemy continues to believe in someone else's game already. Thus ends the main turn of the whole drama. The Germans send into the rear a man who was supposed to approach Stalin. Soviet counterintelligence intercepts him almost immediately, but instead of a simple finale, launches a far more dangerous mechanism. From this moment, the question is no longer whether the assassination will take place. The question is different: how long the enemy will live inside a carefully maintained deception, and how many more decisions it will make without understanding that the game is already lost. The strategic meaning of this story is revealed not at the moment of Tavrin's detention, but later when it becomes clear. Soviet counterintelligence managed not only to disrupt the design, but also to seize the initiative itself. The enemy expected to conduct into the rear an executor of a special mission. Instead, it found itself drawn into a game where it continued to act without understanding that its channel was already controlled by the other side. For SMERSH and the structures connected with it, this was a result of the highest class. In secret war, it is not enough simply to neutralize a saboteur. It is far more important to force the enemy to keep making mistakes, to make false decisions, and to waste forces on an operation that is already dead. That is exactly what happened in the Tavrin case. The German center was losing not only people and resources, it was losing the most valuable thing: a sense of reality. In the military sense, the operation did not change the course of campaigns the way army victories or encirclements at the front do. But the significance of such cases is measured differently. In the autumn of '44, the Red Army is advancing, Germany is retreating, and a strike at the supreme leadership of the USSR could have had an enormous political and psychological effect. Even a single assassination attempt was capable of causing shock, attention and a large-scale restructuring of the security system. Therefore, the elimination of this threat had significance far beyond one detention. The Soviet side not only stopped a dangerous plan, it closed off the possibility of a strike at the very summit of command at the moment when the outcome of the war was already tilting in favor of the USSR. But the price of any destabilization remained colossal. In such a situation, even a foiled design against Stalin became a matter of state importance of the very highest level. No less important is how the command had to look at this story. If the enemy managed to prepare an agent with documents of a SMERSH major, awards, a frontline veteran's legend, and a special weapon, then the matter was not a random act of sabotage. It was an alarm signal for the entire security system. It showed that the enemy was seeking not only a weak point in the defense, but also a path to the most closed center of Soviet power. That is precisely why the decision to develop the radio game could not have been an ordinary local initiative without control from above. The scale of risk was too great. According to open data, the operation proceeded with the awareness and sanction of the highest leadership of the Soviet Special Services. And this is logical. When the subject of a case becomes a possible assassination attempt on Stalin, the boundaries between frontline counterintelligence, state security, and the political level of power almost disappear. For the German side, the consequences were no less heavy, although not always visible at once. What was failing was not simply one insertion. Under attack was the very logic of the operation. If the center continues to believe the false channel, it is forced to build its decisions on distorted information. And in the world of special services, this means a chain reaction of mistakes. The enemy may wait for something that no longer exists and fail to see what is happening before its eyes. There is another, more subtle result. The Tavrin case shows that by this stage of the war, Soviet counterintelligence was acting not as a defensive shield, but as an active player. SMERSH does not limit itself to the role of a structure that catches violators in the rear. It acts offensively inside the very logic of intelligence struggle. It intercepts, analyzes, uses, and returns the blow in such a way that the enemy itself continues to support its own defeat. For the atmosphere of 44, this is especially revealing. The Red Army is moving forward, and together with it, the apparatus of secret war is maturing. It already knows how not only to react to a threat, but also to transform it into an operational advantage. In this sense, the Tavrin case becomes not an exception from the general picture, but a concentrated expression of how Soviet counterintelligence had changed by the final stage of the war. Faster, harsher, more inventive. But for all the importance of this success, one must not fall into exaggeration here. The Tavrin case was not an event that by itself turned the war around. It does not replace frontline operations, does not determine the fate of Berlin, and does not outweigh the enormous weight of the ordinary soldier's battle. Its significance lies elsewhere. This is a story of a prevented strike at the center of power, of a struggle for the stability of the state, and of how one hidden operation could have consequences disproportionately greater than its outward scale. That is precisely what the strategic heaviness of such episodes consists in. A great war is composed not only of tank wedges, offensives, and artillery barrages. Sometimes its balance is held by inconspicuous decisions taken in the rear, in counterintelligence offices, in radio games about which people are silent for decades afterward. If in the Tavrin case the Soviet side had made a mistake, the consequences could have turned out far louder than the operation itself. Therefore, the reaction of the command to such a success inevitably had to be double. On the one hand, there was a victory. The agent was caught, the channel intercepted, the assassination attempt foiled. On the other, an alarming conclusion. The enemy had come closer to a dangerous line than was allowed even in the darkest calculations. It is precisely such cases that strengthen the system and at the same time force it to become even more suspicious, even more closed, even harsher toward any violation of the norm. Such is the outcome of the fourth act of this story. Formally, we see a local victory of counterintelligence, but in reality, we have something much greater before us. This is the elimination of a political threat, the disruption of a psychological strike at the Kremlin, a demonstration of the maturity of SMERSH, and a rare example of how a captured enemy becomes the continuation of an already Soviet operation. And the deeper one peers into the consequences, the more clearly one understands. In this story, it was not only the fate of one agent that was being decided, but the stability of the very system of power. After the failure of the operation, Tavrin does not disappear from history at once. In this lies one of the darkest features of the case. The man who was prepared as a weapon against Stalin after his detention remains for a long time inside another game, now Soviet. His fate now belongs not to himself, but to the logic of counterintelligence, for which he becomes not simply an arrested man, but working material. The same applies to Lydia Shailova. They are not brought onto a public stage, not turned into a loud show trial of wartime, not made part of open propaganda. On the contrary, dense silence remains around the case for a long time. And this silence says a great deal. The higher the price of the operation, and the deeper the radio game was, the fewer the reasons the authorities had to tell the country about it immediately. After the war, the story does not end with an immediate sentence. This is also important. If the matter had concerned ordinary sabotage, the denouement could have come faster and more simply. But the Tavrin case is connected not only with the assassination attempt itself, but with the subsequent operational combination, which means the finale is pushed back. According to open data, the trial of Tavrin and Shailova took place only in 1951. The sentence was predictable and at the same time symbolic. In 1952, Tavrin and Shailova were shot. Thus ends the personal line of this story. Without heroization, without a last twist, without an attempt to turn them into figures of tragic scale. They enter the case as instruments of one secret war and leave it in the same way, as people completely crushed by the machines of two states. But the historical significance of this plot is not exhausted by their fate. The main thing in the Tavrin case is not only that one agent was supposed to come closer to Stalin than the very logic of the Soviet system allowed. The main thing is that after the capture, another operation began, far rarer and more complex. It is precisely this that turns the episode from an ordinary case about saboteurs into a story of the highest counterintelligence stakes. Today, this story is important because it destroys the habitual, overly simple view of war. It is easy for us to think that secret confrontation ends at the moment of arrest, when the enemy is seized, the weapon found, the documents confiscated. But the Tavrin case shows the opposite. Sometimes it is precisely after the detention that the most important part of the struggle begins, where what is decided is no longer the fate of the executor, but the fate of the whole channel standing behind him. There is another conclusion, no less important. This story shows how real deep counterintelligence worked in the Second World War. Not as a set of interrogations and filtration measures, but as a system capable of using the enemy against himself. SMERSH, in this plot, appears not only as a shield, but as an active player that knows how to turn a foiled assassination into an instrument of disinformation and operational pressure. And finally, the Tavrin case is important because even now, a special archival shadow remains in it. Despite the known framework of events, white spots, disputed details, and differences in emphasis and in the degree of awareness of different structures remain around it. It is precisely this that makes the story so strong. Before us is not a smooth legend, but a real case where some of the answers are still hiding between the lines of old materials. Therefore, the story of Tavrin remains not simply a tale of an unfulfilled killing of Stalin. It is a story about the limits of security, about the price of one well-played legend, and about how closely war sometimes approaches the point after which everything might have gone differently. In this lies its true legacy. not in an effective sensation, but in a cold understanding of how dangerous and sophisticated the invisible war behind the front line was.